It was the greatest secret of the Second World War, a secret on a scale never before imagined. It was a project that employed more than 130,000 people, yet only a handful, perhaps a dozen, knew its ultimate purpose. It involved the construction of entire cities, hidden away in the deserts and mountains of America, cities that appeared on no maps. It consumed a budget of $2 billion, an astronomical sum in the 1940s, all of it hidden from Congress and the American people. This immense clandestine effort was a race against the most terrifying possibility imaginable, the idea that Adolf Hitler and Nazi Germany might build this weapon first. The men and women who worked on this project, who moved their families to these secret cities, were told they were doing vital work for the war. They operated strange machines, watched dials, mixed chemicals, and welded pipes. They knew their job was important, but they had no idea what they were making. They were told that the penalty for loose talk was severe, imprisonment or worse. They worked in a world of total compartmentalization, where the person at the next workbench knew only their tiny piece of the puzzle, and no one saw the full picture. This is the story of how America, in the midst of a global war, harnessed its industrial might and scientific genius to build a weapon of unimaginable power. And I say, this is the story of the Manhattan Project, and the 130,000 people who built the atomic bomb without ever knowing its name. The story does not begin in America. It begins in a laboratory in Berlin. In December of 1938, two German chemists, Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann, were conducting experiments bombarding uranium atoms with tiny particles called neutrons. They were expecting to create heavier elements, but what they found was baffling. The uranium atoms seemed to have vanished, replaced by a much lighter element, barium. They were chemists, not physicists, and they could not explain this impossible result. They wrote to their former colleague, Lise Meitner, a brilliant Austrian physicist who had been forced to flee Germany because she was Jewish. Meitner, along with her nephew Otto Frisch, studied Hahn's findings. And then, on a snowy walk in the Swedish countryside, the incredible truth dawned on them. The uranium atom was not chipping, it was splitting. The neutron was hitting the nucleus of the uranium atom and cleaving it in two, in a process they named fission. But there was something more, something that would change the course of human history. When they calculated the mass of the resulting two atoms, they found it was slightly less than the mass of the original uranium atom. Some mass had been lost. Meitner, recalling the most famous equation of the 20th century, Albert Einstein's E equals m squared, realized what had happened. The lost mass had been converted directly into a tremendous amount of energy. The news of fission spread through the international physics community like a shock wave, and with it came a chilling realization. When the uranium atom split, it not only released energy, it also released several more neutrons. These new neutrons could then fly off and split other uranium atoms, which would release more neutrons, which would split more atoms, and so on. A chain reaction. An uncontrolled chain reaction in a piece of uranium could theoretically release 1,000,000 times more energy than an equivalent amount of TNT. An atomic bomb was in theory possible. In the spring of 1939, as Hitler was preparing to invade Poland, this theoretical possibility took on a terrifying urgency. Many of the physicists who understood this danger were refugees who had fled fascism in Europe. Men like the Hungarian physicist Leo Szilard, Eugene Wigner, and Edward Teller. They had seen firsthand the brutality of the Nazi regime, and they were horrified by the thought of Hitler possessing such a weapon. They knew that Germany still had brilliant physicists, including Werner Heisenberg, who were now working for the Third Reich. The race had begun, whether America knew it or not. Szilard was a man of immense foresight and relentless energy. He knew he had to warn the American government. But who would listen to a group of foreign-born scientists with thick accents? He needed a voice that could not be ignored. He sought out the most famous scientist in the world, Albert Einstein. In a small cabin on Long Island, in the summer of 1939, Szilard and Widner explained the chain reaction to Einstein. Einstein, a devoted pacifist, was stunned. He had never considered that his equation could lead to such a terrible weapon, but he understood the greater danger of a Nazi atomic bomb. He agreed to sign a letter, drafted by Szilard, addressed to President Franklin D. Roosevelt. The letter was cautious, but its message was clear. It warned that extremely powerful bombs of a new type may thus be constructed. It urged the president to secure a supply of uranium for the United States and to speed up experimental work. The letter was delivered to Roosevelt in October 1939. The president, a man who understood power, grasped the implications immediately. "This requires action," he said. He established the Advisory Committee on Uranium, a small group tasked with investigating the matter, but for the next 2 years, the effort moved at a glacial pace. It was a purely theoretical project, with a tiny budget, struggling for attention in a country that was still deeply isolationist and not yet at war. Then came December 7, 1941. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor plunged the United States into the Second World War. Suddenly, everything changed. The theoretical became urgent. The small research project was about to become the largest industrial undertaking in human history. The American government, now fully committed to winning the war, was ready to gamble on the atomic bomb. The project was given, new, deliberately misleading name, the Manhattan Engineer District, a name chosen because its early offices were in Manhattan, and to lead it, the government made 2 of the most consequential appointments of the war. To run the entire vast enterprise, the Army chose Colonel Leslie Groves. Groves was not a scientist. He was a hard-driving, no-nonsense engineer from the Army Corps of Engineers. He had just finished overseeing the construction of the Pentagon, the world's largest office building, a job he completed ahead of schedule and under budget. Groves was brilliant, arrogant, demanding, and possessed an unstoppable will to get things done. He was the perfect man to build an industrial empire from scratch, to cut through red tape, and to enforce the absolute secrecy the project required. Groves knew nothing about nuclear physics, but he knew how to manage massive projects, and he knew how to make people do what he wanted. Groves' first and most important task was to find a scientific director, someone who could marshal the brainpower of the nation's best scientists and solve the myriad of problems that stood between the theory of a chain reaction and a functional weapon. He found his man in a surprising choice. J. Robert Oppenheimer was a theoretical physicist at the University of California, Berkeley. He was a genius, a charismatic and deeply complex man. He was a master of quantum mechanics, but he had no experience managing anything larger than a university seminar. He was thin, chain-smoking, and had a history of associations with known communists, which made him a security risk in the eyes of the FBI. But Oppenheimer possessed a unique gift. He had a lightning-fast mind that could understand and synthesize ideas from every branch of science, from physics and chemistry to metallurgy and engineering. And he had a magnetic personality that inspired devotion and brilliance in others. Groves saw this. Despite the security concerns, he took a risk on Oppenheimer, making him the director of the secret weapons laboratory. It was a gamble that would pay off spectacularly. The partnership between the pragmatic, forceful general and the brilliant, brooding physicist would be the driving force behind the Manhattan Project. The project faced a monumental industrial challenge. Nature itself had presented a formidable obstacle. The key to the atomic bomb was uranium-235, but natural uranium ore is composed of over 99% of a different, non-fissile isotope, uranium-238. These 2 types of uranium, or isotopes, are chemically identical. They are like twins that cannot be separated by any normal chemical process. The only difference between them is that uranium-238 is slightly heavier. Separating the tiny fraction of U-235 from the vast mass of U-238 was like trying to find a single specific grain of sand on a vast beach. To build a single bomb, they would need dozens of pounds of pure U-235. Two main methods were proposed to achieve this Herculean task of enrichment, and to house these processes General Groves, with his new authority, authorized the seizure of a massive 59,000-acre tract of land in the rolling hills of eastern Tennessee. It was an isolated rural area near a small town called Clinton. Here, the Army would build a secret city from the ground up. They would name it Oak Ridge. Within months, a valley of Appalachian farms was transformed into a sprawling industrial landscape. Thousands of construction workers descended on the area, building roads, houses, and three of the largest factories the world had ever seen. They worked around the clock, in a sea of mud and noise, and they did so under a blanket of absolute secrecy. They were building something for the war. That's all they knew. The city of Oak Ridge itself was a marvel of planning and secrecy. It was a government town, enclosed by fences and armed guards. To enter, you needed a pass. To live there, you had to be part of the project. The city grew almost overnight to a population of 75,000, making it the fifth largest city in Tennessee, yet its existence was a state secret. Residents were issued mailboxes with post office box numbers in distant cities. They were constantly reminded by billboards and posters that what you see here, what you do here, what you hear here, when you leave here, let it stay here. The phrase "loose lips sink ships" took on a profound new meaning in Oak Ridge. The first massive factory built at Oak Ridge was the Y-12 plant. It was designed to separate the uranium isotopes using an electromagnetic process. The principle was relatively simple, an adaptation of a device called a mass spectrometer. A stream of vaporized uranium was fired into a powerful magnetic field. The lighter U-235 atoms would be deflected by the magnet in a slightly tighter arc than the heavier U-238 atoms. The two streams would then be collected in separate bins. The concept was sound, but scaling it up to an industrial level was a nightmare. The process was incredibly inefficient. It would take thousands of these separation units, which they called calutrons, working for months to produce enough U-235 for a single bomb. The magnets themselves required so much copper for their electrical windings that it would have crippled the American war effort. So the project turned to the U.S. Treasury and borrowed nearly 15,000 tons of silver, a material that is an even better electrical conductor than copper, to use for the magnet coils. At the end of the war, the silver was melted down and returned to Fort Knox. The people who ran the calutrons were mostly young women, many recruited from rural high schools in Tennessee and the surrounding areas. They were chosen because they were seen as diligent and less likely to ask questions. They sat on high stools in long rows, in front of massive control panels covered in dials and gauges. They had no idea what was happening inside the giant machines they were tending. Their instructions were simple. When the needle on this dial moves into the red, you turn this knob to the left. When it moves into the blue, you turn this knob to the right. Their job was to keep the needles centered. They were trained for weeks to do just this, and nothing more. One operator, when asked by a manager what she thought was happening behind the panel, guessed that she was separating different kinds of milk, like pasteurization. Another thought she was making vitamins. They had no concept of uranium, isotopes, or atomic energy. They were just doing their part for the war. They became known as the Calutron Girls, and their meticulous work, repeated millions of times over, slowly, painstakingly, separated the atoms that would fuel the first atomic bomb. While the Y-12 plant was under construction, an even larger facility was being built next to it. This was the K-25 plant, designed for a different enrichment method called gaseous diffusion. This process was even more complex. It took advantage of the fact that in a gas, Lighter molecules move slightly faster than heavier ones. The idea was to turn uranium into a gas, uranium hexafluoride, which is highly corrosive, and pump it through a series of filters, or barriers, with billions of microscopic holes. The slightly lighter U-235 gas molecules would pass through the tiny holes slightly more often than the U-238 molecules. The difference in separation at each stage was tiny, so the gas would have to be pumped through a cascade of thousands of these barriers to gradually increase the concentration of U-235. The engineering challenges were immense. They had to create pumps and seals that could withstand this incredibly corrosive gas, and they had to invent a barrier material with holes small enough to work, yet strong enough to withstand the pressure. The K-25 building itself was an architectural wonder. It was a U-shaped structure, 4 stories high and half a mile long on each side. At the time of its completion, it was the largest building under a single roof on the entire planet. Thousands of workers built it, having no idea what it was for. The secrecy was so extreme that different construction crews were given blueprints for only small sections of the building, so no one could see the overall design. The K-25 plant, when it finally began operating in 1945, consumed more electricity than a major American city, all to perform the delicate task of sifting atoms. Even as the uranium enrichment effort was getting underway, the project was pursuing a second, parallel path to the bomb. This path involved a completely new, man-made element, plutonium. Early in the project, physicists had discovered that when the common isotope, uranium-238, absorbed a neutron, it did not fission. Instead, through a process of radioactive decay, it transformed into a new element, element 94, which was later named plutonium, and this new element, specifically the isotope plutonium-239, was like U-235, highly fissile. This was a revolutionary discovery. It meant they could create a bomb fuel without the incredibly difficult process of isotope separation. They could breed plutonium in a nuclear reactor. A reactor was a device designed to create a controlled, self-sustaining nuclear chain reaction. In December 1942, under the bleachers of the abandoned football stadium at the University of Chicago, a team led by the brilliant Italian physicist Enrico Fermi achieved the first-ever man-made self-sustaining nuclear chain reaction. They built a pile of graphite blocks and uranium slugs and proved that the theory worked. The atomic age had begun in secret in a squash court in the middle of a major city. Now Groves and his team needed to build industrial-scale reactors to produce plutonium in quantity. For this, they needed another secret site. They chose a vast, desolate area of sagebrush desert in eastern Washington state, along the banks of the cold, fast-flowing Columbia River. The river was crucial, as they would need immense amounts of water to cool the reactors. Here, in a place they named the Hanford Engineer Works, they built another secret city and a series of colossal factories. The centerpiece of Hanford was the B reactor, the world's first large-scale nuclear reactor. It was a massive cube of graphite, 36 feet tall, penetrated by thousands of channels. Workers would load uranium fuel slugs into these channels. Inside the reactor, the chain reaction would begin, bombarding the uranium with neutrons and slowly transmuting some of the U-238 into plutonium. After several months, the irradiated slugs would be pushed out the back of the reactor into a deep pool of water to cool them down. Then, using remote-controlled machinery operated from behind thick concrete walls, the slugs would be dissolved in powerful acid to chemically separate the small amount of plutonium that had been created. The work at Hanford was, if anything, even more mysterious and dangerous than at Oak Ridge. The workers there were dealing with intense radioactivity, a force they could not see, smell, or feel, but one they were told was deadly. They worked in vast, windowless concrete buildings they called canyons, operating robotic cranes and chemical vats from a safe distance. The secrecy was total. They knew they were processing slugs that came from the strange reactors by the river, and that the final product was a small amount of a mysterious silvery metal, but they had no idea it was a new element, let alone the core of a weapon. The startup of the B reactor in September 1944 nearly ended in disaster. After running for a few hours, the reactor mysteriously shut itself down. The chain reaction just stopped. The project's top physicists, including Fermi, were rushed to the site. They were in a state of panic. After 2 frantic days of calculations, they discovered the problem, a byproduct of the fission process. An isotope called xenon-135 was a neutron poison. It was absorbing all the free neutrons needed to sustain the chain reaction. Fortunately, the engineers at DuPont, who had designed the reactor, had, over the scientists' objections, included extra fuel channels in the design. By loading these extra channels with more uranium, they were able to override the poisoning effect and restart the reactor. It was a close call that demonstrated just how much they were learning as they went. While the industrial cities of Oak Ridge and Hanford were churning out the raw materials for the bomb, the task of designing and building the actual weapon was happening in a third secret city, the most secret of them all. This was the place that Robert Oppenheimer would create and lead. He and Groves chose a remote, stunningly beautiful mesa in the high desert of northern New Mexico, a place that had been home to a boys' ranch school. They called it Site Y, but it would become known to the world as Los Alamos. Los Alamos was the brain of the Manhattan Project. Oppenheimer recruited a dream team of the greatest scientific minds in the world. Nobel laureates, brilliant young physicists, chemists, and engineers were persuaded to leave their university posts and disappear. They moved their families to this muddy, isolated, and hastily built town on top of a mountain. Surrounded by barbed wire, they were told only that they were working on a top-secret project to help win the war. The atmosphere at Los Alamos was a unique combination of intense intellectual pressure and frontier town informality. The greatest minds of a generation worked feverishly 6 days a week, often late into the night, debating complex physics problems. But on their days off, they would hike in the mountains, go skiing, or attend parties where they would let off steam. The scientists at Los Alamos were tasked with solving a problem of unprecedented difficulty. How do you take a lump of fissile material, either uranium or plutonium, and make it explode? The basic concept was to create a critical mass. A small piece of uranium is safe. The neutrons released by fission just fly out into the air. But if you assemble enough uranium, about the size of a grapefruit, into a dense sphere, the neutrons from one fission are more likely to hit another uranium nucleus before they can escape. This creates the runaway chain reaction, the explosion. The challenge was to bring 2 subcritical pieces of uranium together into a single critical mass with incredible speed. If they came together too slowly, the reaction would start prematurely, fizzle, and blow the bomb apart before it could generate a massive explosion. For the uranium bomb, the design was relatively straightforward, an elegant piece of brute force engineering. They would build a cannon, a small subcritical piece of U-235. The bullet would be fired down a gun barrel into a larger, subcritical piece of U-235, the target. The 2 pieces would slam together, form a critical mass, and the chain reaction would begin. This gun-type design was so simple and reliable that the scientists were confident it would work without ever being tested. They named this bomb Little Boy. The plutonium bomb, however, was a far greater challenge. Early tests showed that the plutonium being produced at Hanford contained a contaminant isotope, plutonium-240. This isotope had a high rate of spontaneous fission, meaning it was constantly spitting out stray neutrons. If they tried to use the gun-type design with plutonium, these stray neutrons would start the chain reaction the instant the 2 pieces began to come together. The bomb would fizzle, a failure. This was a crisis that threatened to make the entire Hanford plant useless. A new, far more radical method of detonation was needed. A young physicist named Seth Neddermeyer proposed a wild idea: implosion. The idea was to take a subcritical sphere of plutonium and surround it with powerful conventional explosives. If they could detonate all these explosives at precisely the same microsecond, the force of the inward blast wave would crush the plutonium sphere, squeezing its atoms together until it became dense enough to reach criticality. It was an idea of staggering difficulty. The implosion had to be perfectly symmetrical. If one side of the blast wave arrived a fraction of a microsecond before the other, the plutonium core would just be squirted out the side like a watermelon seed. To achieve this perfect symmetry, the project's top explosive expert, George Kistikowski, developed a complex arrangement of precisely shaped explosive charges, called lenses, that would focus the blast wave inward, just as an optical lens focuses light. The engineering and physics problems were immense, and for many months, no one knew if it would even work. This implosion-type bomb, a complex sphere of wires, detonators, explosives, and a plutonium core, was nicknamed Fat Man. By the summer of 1945, the project was nearing its climax. The war in Europe was over. Hitler was dead, and the fear of a Nazi bomb was gone. But the war in the Pacific raged on with incredible ferocity. An American invasion of Japan was being planned, an operation that military leaders predicted would cost 1 million American casualties and many more Japanese lives. President Roosevelt had died in April, and the new president, Harry S. Truman, was now briefed on the great secret. The decision of whether and how to use this new weapon would fall to him. But first, they had to know if the most complex part of the project, the plutonium implosion bomb, actually worked. A test was needed. Groves chose a remote patch of desert in southern New Mexico they called the Jornada del Muerto, the Journey of the Dead. The test was codenamed Trinity. In the pre-dawn hours of July 16, 1945, the world's first atomic device, nicknamed the Gadget, sat atop a 100-foot steel tower. The scientists and military personnel watched from bunkers miles away. The mood was incredibly tense. Some feared the bomb would be a dud, a humiliating failure. Oppenheimer was so anxious he was practically skeletal. A few even harbored a tiny, terrifying fear that the explosion might ignite the Earth's atmosphere and destroy the world. The test was delayed by a thunderstorm, but finally, the countdown began. At 5 hours 29 minutes and 45 seconds a.m., the gadget detonated. The result was beyond anything anyone had ever imagined. First, there was a flash of light, a light brighter than a dozen suns, a light that illuminated the entire desert and the mountains miles away with a searing, otherworldly brilliance. A man who was miles away and not looking directly at it said it was like someone had opened an oven door in his face. Then came the heat, a wave of warmth like a summer day, even from 10 miles away. Then, after a long, silent pause, came the sound, a deep, deafening, continuous roar that echoed off the mountains for minutes. A colossal, churning mushroom cloud of purple, orange, and white fire rose from the desert floor, climbing miles into the sky. The steel tower had not just melted, it had vaporized. The desert sand below had been fused into a glassy green mineral, which they named Trinitite. General Thomas Farrell, Groves' deputy, described it as a scene that beggared description. He said the whole country was lighted by a searing light with the intensity many times that of the midday sun. It was golden, purple, violet, gray, and blue. It lighted every peak, crevasse, and ridge of the nearby mountain range with a clarity and beauty that cannot be described but must be seen to beautiful. You believed. Oppenheimer, watching the terrifying beautiful spectacle, was reminded of a line from the Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita. Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds. The test was a success. The atomic age had arrived. The news was flashed to President Truman, who was in Potsdam, Germany. meeting with Winston Churchill and Joseph Stalin. The complex machinery of war began to move. On August 6, 1945, a B-29 bomber, named the Enola Gay, took off from the island of Tinian. In its bomb bay was Little Boy, the uranium gun-type bomb. Its target was the Japanese city of Hiroshima. At 8:15 in the morning, the bomb was dropped. It exploded with the force of 15,000 tons of TNT, leveling the city and instantly killing an estimated 80,000 people. 3 days later, on August 9th, another B-29 boxcar dropped Fat Man, the plutonium implosion bomb, on the city of Nagasaki. The devastation was repeated. On August 15th, Japan announced its unconditional surrender. The Second World War was over. Back in the United States, in the secret cities of Oak Ridge, Hanford, and Los Alamos, the news was met with a complex mixture of emotions. For the first time, the 130,000 workers of the Manhattan Project learned what they had been making. The newspapers were filled with stories about the atomic bomb. The Kelutron girls in Tennessee finally understood that the needles they had been watching were not for vitamins, but for separating the atoms of a weapon that had leveled a city. The workers in the canyons of Hanford realized that the mysterious metal they had been producing was the core of a second, even more complex bomb. There was pride, a sense of having contributed to the end of the war and saving American lives. But there was also shock, and for many, a deep sense of unease. The scientists at Los Alamos, who understood the full implications of what they had unleashed, felt this most acutely. Many celebrated the end of the war, but others felt a profound sense of horror and guilt. They knew that the secret they had unlocked could never be put back. They had given humanity the power to destroy itself. The world had been changed forever, in ways they were only beginning to comprehend. The greatest secret of the war was finally out, and the world would never be the same.